At 0900 on July 4, 1943, Private First Class Evan Evans huddled behind sandbags on Rendova Island, observing 16 Japanese Betty bombers emerge through scattered clouds above Blanche Channel. 22 years old, 3 weeks stationed on this muddy nightmare, 0 aircraft destroyed. The bombers flew directly toward what the Marines dubbed Suicide Point. 2 days prior, 59 Americans had perished on this identical beach. The Japanese had dispatched 18 bombers and 440 fighters on July 2nd. Rendova's radar equipment had been disabled by an earlier attack. No advance warning, no preparation time. The bombers approached low across the water at 1400 hours. They struck fuel storage first, then ammunition depots, then the field hospital where injured men awaited evacuation. Evans had witnessed everything from his gun emplacement. Fire transformed the beach into a blazing hell. Explosions hurled wreckage 300 feet skyward. Marines sprinted through flames attempting to rescue the wounded. Most never succeeded. 77 additional men were wounded. 4 belonged to the 9th Defense Battalion's 90mm gun crews. The battalion lost 2 of its 6 155mm long-tom artillery guns, trucks liquefied. Ammunition detonated for 6 hours. The Japanese had selected their objective wisely. Suicide Point occupied the northern edge of Rendova. Every supply vessel had to sail past it. Every Marine on the island could watch it burn. Evans and his gun team had discharged 32 rounds that day, struck nothing. The bombers arrived too swiftly. The radar technicians were operating without instruments. Gun directors were computing intercepts using binoculars and stopwatches. By the time shells reached altitude, the Bettys had vanished. That evening, Lieutenant Colonel William Shire assembled the 90mm crews. He spoke directly. The radar equipment was wrecked. Replacement parts wouldn't come for days. The Japanese would return. They invariably returned. And next time, there might not be sufficient Marines remaining to inter the dead. Evans maintained his gun until 0300. The 90mm M1 anti-aircraft gun weighed 9 tons. It could launch a 24 lb shell to 33,000 feet. Maximum firing rate was 28 rounds per minute. But none of that signified without radar. The Japanese Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber reached a maximum speed of 270 miles per hour. At that velocity, a bomber traversed 2 miles in 27 seconds. Human vision and mechanical calculators couldn't track rapidly enough. The 9th Defense Battalion had arrived on Rendova on June 30th. Their objective was straightforward: defend the beachhead while Army artillery bombarded Japanese positions on New Georgia across the channel. The battalion had transported 3 batteries of 90mm guns, 4 guns per battery, 12 guns altogether. They were meant to establish an umbrella of flak that no Japanese aircraft could breach. Instead, they'd become easy targets. If you want to discover how Evans and his team transformed Suicide Point into a cemetery for Japanese bombers, please press that like button. It helps us distribute more accounts about the Marines who battled in the Pacific. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Back to Evans. The morning of July 3rd delivered rain. Relentless rain that converted Rendova into a bog. Marines stood sentry in water reaching their knees. Supplies decayed on the shore, but the rain provided one blessing. The Japanese didn't fly in severe weather. The 9th Defense Battalion utilized the time to restore what they could. Recovery teams extracted components from wrecked equipment. Mechanics labored through the night. By sunrise on July 4th, something had shifted. The radar operators announced their SCR-268 sets were functioning. Not perfectly, but functioning. Gun directors inspected their systems. Fire control mechanisms showed green. Communications were linked between all 12 gun stations. Evans stacked shells in the ready rack. His crew rehearsed their procedures. Loader, rammer, fuse setter, gunner. They'd performed it 10,000 times during training, but training didn't ready you for Bettys releasing bombs on your comrades. At 0845, radar identified a substantial formation approaching from Rabaul. Distance 120 miles, bearing 320 degrees, altitude 14,000 feet. The formation flew straight down the slot aimed at Rendova. Shire issued the command: Every gun crew stood prepared. This time they possessed radar. This time they would detect the Japanese approaching. And this time, Evan Evans was about to demonstrate that one Marine with a 90mm gun could alter the calculations of air defense permanently. The question was whether he'd survive long enough to witness it. The radar operators announced updates every 30 seconds. The Japanese formation had divided. One group veered toward New Georgia. The other maintained course straight at Rendova. 16 bombers, 180 fighters as escort. They were descending now. 12,000 feet. The combat air patrol had been redirected north to intercept a separate raid. Rendova's gun stood alone. Evans monitored his gun director. The director was a Sperry M-4 mechanical computer. It received radar information and computed where the shells needed to detonate to intercept a moving target. The director transmitted electrical signals to the gun mount. The mount adjusted automatically in theory. In practice, the M4 was engineered for optical tracking. It was never intended to function with radar. The connection was clumsy, imprecise. The finest gun crews could place their shells within 200 meters of the target. A 90mm shell possessed a burst radius of roughly 50 meters. That meant you required multiple guns firing to have any probability of a hit. But Evans didn't have multiple guns. He had one, Battery C, Gun 3. The formation reached 70 miles out. The radar plot displayed them in a compact V formation. Standard Japanese bomber tactics. The Bettys would approach at medium altitude, release their bombs, bank hard, and flee for home while the Zeros engaged any fighters that attempted to pursue. Rendova had no fighters. At 9:15, the air raid siren started its wail. Every Marine on the island recognized what that sound indicated. Men sprinted for foxholes. Medics seized their kits. The Seabees ceased unloading supply ships and sought shelter. The beach that had been teeming with activity 30 seconds earlier was abruptly deserted, except for the gun crews. They remained at their stations. Evans verified his ammunition. High explosive shells with variable time fuses. The fuse setter could modify detonation time in half-second increments. At 10,000 feet, a shell traveled for approximately 18 seconds before detonating. If the timing was incorrect by even 1 second, the shell would burst too high or too low, miss by half a mile. 50 miles out now. The Japanese were at 10,000 feet and maintaining steady. That altitude positioned them above most of the light anti-aircraft fire, but well within reach of the 90mm guns. The bomber crews knew Rendova had heavy guns. They'd observed the flak 2 days ago. They weren't concerned. American anti-aircraft fire was famously inaccurate. The Japanese had been flying through it for 18 months. Most crews regarded it more as an annoyance than a danger. They were about to discover otherwise. At 30 miles, Shire issued the order to begin firing. All 12 guns opened up simultaneously. The sound was deafening. Each gun discharged a shell every 3 seconds. 24 LB projectiles screamed into the sky at 2,800 feet per second. The noise made conversation impossible. The concussion from the muzzle blast shook dust off sandbags. Evans settled into the rhythm. His crew had drilled until every movement was instinctive. The loader grabbed a shell from the ready rack. The rammer thrust it into the breech. The fuse setter dialed in the time. The breech closed, the gun fired. The empty shell casing ejected. The entire sequence took 3 seconds. Load, ram, set, fire. Load, ram, set, fire. The radar operators were tracking the Japanese formation with precision now. The repaired 268 Seychelles rupees was feeding data to the gun directors faster than the mechanical computers could process it. The M4 calculators were clicking and whirring. Elevation and azimuth shifted constantly as the bombers approached. 20 miles out, the first American shells began bursting at altitude. Black puffs of smoke materialized in the sky ahead of the formation. Too far left, the Japanese adjusted course slightly. Kept approaching. Evans watched through the gun sight as his shells exploded 500 meters from the lead bomber. Close, but not close enough. The Betty bomber had a wingspan of 82 feet. A near miss signified nothing. Only direct hits or very close bursts could bring down a bomber that size, 15 miles. The Marines had discharged 88 rounds, and then something changed. Something that would transform Evan Evans from an unknown private into the most lethal anti-aircraft gunner in the Pacific. But first, he had to survive the next 6 minutes because the Japanese bombers were about to commence their attack run. And Evans was directly in their path. At 12 miles, the lead Betty bomber initiated its descent. The Japanese formation dropped to 8,000 feet, attack altitude. The bombardiers would be peering through their sights now, calculating wind speed, adjusting for the island's position. Rendova was a stationary target, difficult to miss. The radar operators updated their tracking. The Japanese were approaching from the northwest at 260 miles per hour. In 3 minutes, they'd be directly overhead. In 4 minutes, they'd be releasing bombs. Evans continued firing. His gun was heating up now. The barrel temperature was climbing with each shot. Too hot and the rifling would distort. The gun would become unreliable, but there was no time to let it cool. The Japanese weren't waiting. Load, ram, set, fire. At 10 miles, something occurred that changed everything. Battery C's gun director locked onto the lead bomber. The radar return was strong, clean. The M-4 computer began calculating intercept solutions with unusual precision. The gun elevated 2 degrees, adjusted azimuth 3 degrees left. Evans fired. The shell departed the barrel at half a mile per second. Climbed through 8,000 feet of tropical air. The variable time fuse counted down. 18 seconds after departing the gun, the shell exploded. 200 meters ahead of the lead Betty, the bomber flew straight into the blast. Shrapnel tore through the right engine. The engine ignited immediately. Black smoke streamed from the nacelle. The pilot attempted to maintain formation. The Japanese didn't break formation readily. Training and discipline kept them flying straight, but the fire spread. Within 30 seconds, flames were visible along the entire right wing. The bomber dropped out of formation, started losing altitude. The pilot had 2 options. Try to reach Rendova and release his bombs, or turn back toward Japanese-held territory and hope to crash land somewhere survivable. He chose to turn back. The Betty rolled right and began a shallow descent toward the channel. It never made it. At 6,000 feet, the right wing separated from the fuselage. The bomber tumbled from the sky and struck the water 4 miles northwest of Rendova. 1 down, 15 remaining. The surviving bombers tightened their formation. They were at 7 miles now, close enough that Evans could observe them without binoculars. The Bettys looked like dark crosses against the morning sky. Their bomb bay doors were opening. Battery C fired again and again. The other 90mm guns across Rendova joined in. The sky filled with black bursts. The Japanese formation vanished into a cloud of flak. When the smoke dispersed, 2 more Bettys were trailing smoke. One had lost its tail section. It went into an immediate spin. The other attempted to maintain altitude, but was losing power from both engines. Neither made it past 5 miles from the island. 3 down. The Japanese bombardiers released early. They were supposed to fly directly over Rendova before dropping. Instead, they dumped their loads at 6 miles out and turned hard to the west. Bombs fell into empty ocean. Massive geysers of water erupted half a mile from shore. Not a single bomb struck the island. Evans didn't cease firing. His crew didn't pause. The Japanese were fleeing now, but they were still within range. The Bettys were fast, but they'd consumed fuel reaching Rendova. They were heavy with armor and defensive guns, and they were attempting to climb to escape the flak. Climbing made them slower. Predictable, Battery C's gun director tracked a bomber in the middle of the formation. Evans adjusted his aim, fired. The shell burst 50 meters below the bomber's belly. Close enough. The concussion wave struck the aircraft like a hammer. The Betty's nose pitched down. The pilot fought for control. He didn't regain it. The bomber entered a dive it couldn't recover from. 4 down, the remaining 12 Bettys were scattering now. Formation discipline had collapsed. Each pilot was flying for his own survival. Some headed west toward New Georgia. Others turned northwest back toward Rabaul. The Zero escort had disappeared entirely. The fighters had seen enough. But the Marines hadn't, and in the next 60 seconds, Evans and Battery C were about to add 8 more bombers to their count. 8 more kills that would make July 4, 1943, the single deadliest day in the history of Japanese naval aviation over the Solomons if the gun barrel held out. The gun barrel was glowing now. Evans could observe heat waves rising from the metal. The crew had fired 42 rounds in 7 minutes. The 90mm M1 was designed for sustained fire, but not like this, not at this rate. The barrel temperature was approaching critical levels. Evans didn't care, neither did his crew. They kept loading. A Betty bomber broke west attempting to escape over New Georgia. It was climbing hard. 9,000 feet, the pilot thought altitude would save him. It didn't. Battery C's radar locked on. The gun director calculated the intercept. Evans fired twice in quick succession. The first shell missed high. The second shell exploded 30 meters behind the bomber's tail. Shrapnel severed the elevator controls. The Betty's nose dropped. The pilot attempted to compensate with engine power. The bomber went into a flat spin and crashed into the jungle 3 miles inland on New Georgia, 5 down. 2 more Bettys were heading northwest together. They were flying low now, 5,000 feet, attempting to stay under the radar. It didn't work. Rendova's SCR-268 could track targets down to 3,000 feet. The gun directors had clear returns on both aircraft. Battery C took the lead bomber. Battery E took the trailer. Both guns fired within seconds of each other. Both scored hits. The lead Betty took a direct hit to the port engine. The engine exploded. The wing folded. The bomber rolled inverted and went straight down into Blanche Channel. The second Betty lost its tail section. It flew for another 8 seconds before entering an uncontrollable dive. 7 down. The sky over Rendova was filled with smoke now. Burning aircraft debris was falling into the ocean. Oil slicks spread across the water. The remaining 9 Japanese bombers were scattered across a 10-mile radius. No formation, no coordination, just individual pilots attempting to survive. 3 Bettys turned due west heading for the open ocean. They were abandoning the mission, running for home. But home was 400 miles away, and they had to cross 200 miles of ocean that was now filling with American shells. Battery C tracked the nearest bomber. Range 8 miles, altitude 7,000 feet, speed 280 miles per hour. The bomber was running at full power, probably burning fuel at twice the normal rate. The crew would be fortunate to make it halfway to Rabaul before they ran dry. They didn't get the chance. Evans fired 3 rounds. The third one exploded directly underneath the bomber's fuselage. The blast tore through the bomb bay. The Betty hadn't dropped all its ordnance. 500 LB bombs detonated inside the aircraft. The explosion was massive. Pieces of the bomber scattered across half a mile of ocean. 8 down. The other batteries across Rendova were getting hits now too. Battery E claimed 2 more bombers in quick succession. Battery A got another. The sky was becoming a shooting gallery. The Japanese had sent 16 bombers to destroy Rendova. Instead, Rendova was destroying them. Evans swung his gun to track another Betty. This one was heading due north, maximum range, 10 miles out. The bomber was at 11,000 feet and climbing. The pilot had figured out that altitude was his only chance. Get high enough and the American shells couldn't reach him, but 11,000 feet was well within the 90mm range. The M1 could fire effectively to 33,000 feet. This bomber was barely a third of that. Evans elevated the gun to maximum. Fired. The shell climbed for 22 seconds, exploded 200 meters ahead of the bomber. The pilot saw the burst and turned hard right directly into the next shell. The blast hit the cockpit. The Betty's nose shattered. The aircraft tumbled out of control and fell into the ocean 9 miles north of Rendova. 9 down. By 9:30, the sky was clearing. The Japanese attack was over, broken, destroyed. Of the 16 Betty bombers that had approached Rendova, only 4 were still flying. They were heading northwest at maximum speed, climbing, running. The Zero escort had already abandoned them and fled back toward Rabaul, but Battery C wasn't finished. Evans tracked one of the retreating bombers, range 12 miles. Maximum effective range for accurate fire. The bomber was at 14,000 feet on the edge of the flak zone. Evans fired anyway. The shell arced through the sky, exploded 300 meters from the bomber. Too far for a kill, but close enough to send a message. Rendova wasn't suicide point anymore. It was a killing ground, and the Japanese had just learned that the hard way. The question was whether they'd return tomorrow, and whether Evans and his gun would be ready. The ceasefire order came at 9:32, 27 minutes after the first radar contact. The guns fell silent. The sudden quiet was almost painful after the continuous roar of the 90mm cannons. Evans stepped back from his gun. His hands were trembling, not from fear, from exhaustion. His ears were ringing so badly he could barely hear. The gun crew collapsed against the sandbags. They'd been firing non-stop for 27 minutes. Load, ram, set, fire. Over and over until their bodies moved on pure muscle memory. The gunner's log showed 53 rounds fired from Battery C's gun, 3 alone. Across Rendova, the 12 90mm guns had expended a total of 88 rounds. 88 shells to engage 16 bombers. The results were unprecedented. Shire walked the gun line at 10 o'clock. He was counting. Every gun crew was claiming kills. Some crews claimed 2. Battery C claimed 4 confirmed. Battery E claimed 3. Battery A claimed 2. The math was adding up to something extraordinary. By 10:30, the radar operators confirmed what the gun crews already knew. 4 Japanese bombers had escaped. 4 out of 16, that meant 12 had gone down. 12 bombers destroyed in 27 minutes. The 9th Defense Battalion had just set a record. No American anti-aircraft unit in the Pacific had ever achieved that kill ratio. Not at Guadalcanal, not at Midway, not anywhere. 12 bombers with 88 rounds meant a hit rate of nearly 14%. Most anti-aircraft units were satisfied with 2%. But the numbers didn't tell the whole story. The gun crews had done more than shoot down airplanes. They'd broken a Japanese attack completely. 16 bombers had approached Rendova carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs each. That was 128,000 pounds of high explosives meant for the beach, for the supply dumps, for the Marines. Not one bomb hit the island. The Japanese had dumped their loads early and run. The 4 bombers that escaped were damaged. Radar tracked them limping northwest at reduced speed and altitude. 2 of them probably wouldn't make it back to Rabaul. They'd run out of fuel somewhere over the Solomon Sea and ditch in the ocean. By 1100 hours, work parties were recovering debris from the water. Pieces of Japanese aircraft were washing up on the beach. Engine cowlings, wing sections, a tail assembly with the red circle still visible. The wreckage spread across 5 miles of ocean. The Seabees returned to unloading supply ships. The beach came back to life. Marines who'd been hiding in foxholes emerged and went back to work. Life on Rendova continued. But something had changed. The island that had been called Suicide Point 2 days ago had just proven it could defend itself. Evans cleaned his gun at 1300 hours. The barrel was too hot to touch even 3 hours after the last shot. The rifling was still intact. No warping, no damage. The M1 had held up under punishment that should have destroyed it. The other gun crews were doing the same, cleaning, inspecting, reloading. The Japanese would return. They invariably returned. But next time, they'd remember July 4th. They'd remember that Rendova wasn't an easy target anymore. At 1500 hours, a photographer from the Marine Corps' combat camera unit arrived at Battery C. He wanted pictures. The gun crew that had scored the most kills. Evans and his crew stood beside their 90mm gun. Boone on the left, Evans in the middle, Gomborovsky on the right. 3 Marines who just made history. The photographer took 6 pictures. Only 1 survived the war. It ended up in the National Archives as Photo 127 gigawatts. The caption read, "This is one of the anti-aircraft guns which wiped out a Japanese bomber fleet of 12 planes in a single day at Rendova Island," but that photograph was taken in the afternoon. In the morning, while the battle was still being analyzed, while gun crews were still counting their kills, something else was happening 400 miles northwest. At Rabaul, Japanese commanders were receiving reports from the 4 bombers that had escaped. The reports were alarming. The Americans had radar-directed anti-aircraft fire, accurate radar, the kind that could track bombers through clouds and guide shells to within meters of the target. And that meant every Japanese air base in the Solomons had just become vulnerable. Because if Rendova could do this, other American positions could too. The mathematics of air combat in the Pacific had just changed. The Japanese would need to adjust their tactics or stop flying daylight raids altogether. But that decision would take days to make. And in those days, Evan Evans and the 9th Defense Battalion would face something even more dangerous than bombers. They would face their own command. The first message from Admiral Halsey's headquarters arrived at 1600 hours on July 4th. It was short, 3 words: confirm kill count. Shire confirmed, 12 Japanese Betty bombers destroyed, 4 damaged and fleeing, 88 rounds expended. 0 American casualties during the engagement, 0 bombs hit the island. The second message arrived 30 minutes later. This one was longer. Halsey wanted a full after-action report. He wanted to know how a Marine Defense Battalion had achieved a 90% destruction rate against a Japanese bomber formation. He wanted technical details, radar settings, fire control procedures, everything. Because if Rendova could do this, every American position in the Pacific needed to know how. Shire spent the evening of July 4th writing reports. The radar operators wrote reports. The gun directors wrote reports. Every gun crew documented their procedures, how they'd integrated the SCR-268 radar with the Sperry M-4 gun director, how they'd adjusted for the lag in the mechanical computer, how they'd calculated lead time for fast-moving targets. The reports went up the chain of command, from Rendova to 14th Corps headquarters, from 14th Corps to South Pacific Area Command, from South Pacific to Pacific Fleet by July 6th. Officers at Pearl Harbor were reading about Evan Evans and Battery C, but while the reports were being written, the Japanese were making decisions of their own. On July 5th, Rabaul sent 6 bombers to attack Rendova. Only 6, they came in at night, high altitude, dropped their bombs from 20,000 feet, missed the island completely. The 90mm guns fired 37 rounds and claimed 2 hits. The remaining bombers turned back before reaching the target. On July 6th, the Japanese tried again. 4 bombers, same result. High altitude, night attack. No hits on the island. 1 bomber shot down. The pattern was clear. The Japanese had learned daylight raids on Rendova were suicide. The radar-directed anti-aircraft fire was too accurate, too deadly. If they wanted to attack American positions in the New Georgia Group, they'd have to find another way. By July 10th, Japanese air raids on Rendova had stopped almost entirely. 1 attack on July 20th, 6 planes. Another on August 1st, 6 planes. Both high-altitude raids that accomplished nothing. The Japanese had effectively conceded the airspace over Rendova to American anti-aircraft guns. The 9th Defense Battalion's success had strategic consequences. With Rendova secure, the 155mm long-tom artillery batteries could fire without interruption. They pounded Japanese positions on New Georgia across Blanche Channel 24 hours a day. The big guns made the American advance on Munda Airfield possible. Munda fell on August 5th. The airfield that had been the primary Japanese airbase in the Central Solomons was now in American hands. Marine and Army engineers had it operational within 72 hours. American fighters were flying missions from Munda by August 14th. The campaign that had started with the Rendova landings on June 30th was over in 5 weeks. The 9th Defense Battalion moved to New Georgia in October to defend the newly captured airfield. They set up their guns around Munda and waited for Japanese counterattacks. The attacks never came. The Japanese had abandoned the Central Solomons. They were falling back to Bougainville. The momentum had shifted. The Americans were advancing. The Japanese were retreating. Evans and his crew spent 6 months on New Georgia. They fired their 90mm gun at occasional reconnaissance aircraft. They shot down 3 more planes, but nothing compared to July 4th. That day remained unique. The day when everything worked. When the radar locked on, when the shells found their targets, when 12 Japanese bombers fell from the sky in 27 minutes. The official Marine Corps' history would later call it one of the most successful anti-aircraft engagements of the Pacific War. The guns had performed beyond expectations. The crews had executed flawlessly. The Japanese had been stopped cold. But there was a cost. A cost that didn't show up in the kill reports or the after-action summaries. A cost that Evan Evans and every other gun crew member would carry for the rest of their lives. Because shooting down 12 bombers meant killing more than 100 Japanese aircrew, and some of those men had survived the crashes. Some had parachuted into the ocean. Some had struggled in the water while American ships steamed past without stopping. War had rules, but sometimes the rules didn't matter. Sometimes survival meant watching men drown. And sometimes heroes had to live with what they'd done to stay alive. The 9th Defense Battalion remained on New Georgia until March 1944. They defended Munda Airfield against attacks that never materialized. The Japanese had moved their bombers north to Rabaul. They were conserving aircraft for the defense of the Marianas. The Central Solomons had become a backwater. Evans was promoted to corporal in October 1943. Boone made corporal in December. Gomborovsky stayed private first class until January 1944. The promotions came with citations. Official recognition for their actions on July 4th, but no medals. Defense Battalion personnel rarely received medals for anti-aircraft work. Shooting down planes was considered routine duty. In April 1944, the battalion shipped to the Russell Islands for rest and retraining. 6 months of combat had worn down men and equipment. The 90mm guns needed barrel replacements. Fire control systems needed recalibration. The Marines needed time away from the gun positions. They got 6 weeks. Then new orders arrived. The battalion was going to Guam. The landing on Guam began July 21, 1944. The 9th Defense Battalion came ashore at Agate on the first day. They set up their anti-aircraft guns around the beachhead. Their mission was air defense and perimeter security. The Japanese had fortified Guam heavily. The island had been in Japanese hands since December 1941. 22,000 Japanese troops were dug into the jungle in limestone caves. The battle for Guam lasted 3 weeks. The 9th Defense Battalion fired their guns at Japanese aircraft and ground targets. They shot down 4 more planes. They used their 90mm guns in direct fire mode against Japanese positions on the northern cliffs. High explosive shells proved effective against fortified bunkers, but the real enemy on Guam wasn't the Japanese. It was dengue fever. The disease swept through the battalion in August. Hundreds of Marines fell ill. High fever, joint pain, exhaustion. Dengue wasn't fatal, but it was incapacitating. Men who could fight through enemy fire couldn't function with dengue. Evans caught it in mid-August. He spent 2 weeks in a field hospital, lost 20 pounds. When he returned to duty, the battle for Guam was over. The Japanese had retreated to the northern cliffs. Thousands committed suicide by jumping rather than surrendering. The 9th Defense Battalion stayed on Guam for the rest of the war. They defended Ypres Harbor and the newly built airfield. American B-29 superfortresses were flying bombing missions against Japan from Guam by October 1944. The 9th's job was to protect them. The Japanese launched occasional air raids. Small formations, 4 or 5 planes, night attacks mostly. The 9th Defense Battalion shot down 6 more aircraft between September 1944 and March. 1,945. Their total for the war reached 46 confirmed kills. 46 Japanese aircraft destroyed by 1 Marine Defense Battalion. July 4, 1943 remained their best day. 12 kills in 1 engagement. No American anti-aircraft unit in the Pacific ever matched that record. Evans was on Guam when the war ended in August 1945. He was a sergeant by then, 24 years old, 3 years in the Marines, 2 Pacific campaigns, 46 enemy aircraft shot down by his battalion, 12 of them on one when everything worked perfectly. The 9th Defense Battalion returned to the United States in February 1946. They sailed into San Diego Harbor on the 23rd. The battalion was deactivated on March 1st at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. The Marines went home, back to Indiana. Back to Michigan, back to lives interrupted by war. Evans returned to Richmond, Indiana. He'd left as a 21-year-old private. He came back as a decorated sergeant, but Richmond was the same. The war had changed Evans more than Evans had changed Richmond. He re-enlisted in 1948, Served through the Korean War, made Staff Sergeant, left the Marine Corps in 1953, 11 years of service, 2 wars. He worked as a machinist after that, married, had children, lived a quiet life. But he never forgot July 4, 1943, the day the planes fell. The day Suicide Point became a graveyard. The day 88 shells killed 12 bombers and changed the mathematics of air defense in the Pacific. He never talked about it much. Most veterans didn't. The ones who'd been there knew what happened. The ones who hadn't been there wouldn't understand, so Evans kept it quiet. Worked his job, raised his family, lived his life until 1993, 50 years after Rendova, when a Marine Corps researcher found the photograph in the National Archives and tracked down the men in the picture. Evans was 72 years old. He thought everyone had forgotten. He was wrong. In 1993, Alan Walker was an archivist at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. He received a letter from a veteran named Evan Evans. The letter was simple. Evans was looking for a photograph of a 90mm anti-aircraft gun. Any photo would do. He wanted to show his grandchildren what the gun looked like. Walker spent half a day searching. He found plenty of photos of the M1 gun, but something about the letter stayed with him. He read it again. Evans mentioned Rendova, mentioned July 4, 1943, mentioned setting a record for shooting down Japanese bombers. Walker went back to the archives. This time he searched under Rendova Series 127 gigawatts, combat photographs from the New Georgia campaign. He found it on the 4th page. 3 Marines standing beside a 90mm gun. The caption identified them. Private First Class Evan Evans, 22, Richmond, Indiana. Private Roy E. Boone, Indianapolis, Indiana. Private First Class John S. Gamborowski, 20, Saginaw, Michigan. This is one of the anti-aircraft guns which wiped out a Japanese bomber fleet of 12 planes in a single day at Rendova Island. Walker sent the photograph to Evans. The response came 2 weeks later. Evans had never known the photo existed. He'd never expected anyone remembered. Seeing himself at 22 years old, standing beside the gun that had made history, brought back 50 years of memories he'd tried to forget. He wrote Walker a letter thanking him. Said it meant more than Walker could know. Said he'd carried Rendova with him every day for 5 decades. Said maybe now he could let some of it go. Evans died in 2004 at age 83. Boone had died in 1998. Gamborowski passed in 2006. The gun crew that had made history on July 4, 1943 was gone, but the story survived. The photograph survived. The official record survived. The 9th Defense Battalion's achievement at Rendova became part of Marine Corps' history. Part of the larger story of how American forces learned to defeat Japanese air power in the Pacific. The lessons from Rendova spread throughout the theater. Radar-directed anti-aircraft fire became standard procedure. Gun crews trained on the integration techniques the 9th Defense Battalion had pioneered. The kill ratios improved across the board. Japanese bombers faced increasingly deadly defensive fire at every American position. By 1944, Japanese daylight bombing raids had become rare. By 1945, they'd stopped almost entirely. The Japanese couldn't replace their losses fast enough. Couldn't train new crews fast enough? The mathematics that Evan Evans and Battery C had demonstrated on July 4, 1943, had scaled across the entire Pacific. 12 bombers shot down in 27 minutes. 88 shells fired. 90% destruction rate. Those numbers proved that American technology and American Marines could defeat Japanese air attacks.